It's obviously aimed at dragging Belarusian directly into the conflict and to expand the area of fighting, thereby complicating the possibility of resolving the conflict by political and diplomatic means. And if necessary, we are ready to take the full range of measures provided for by the treaty to ensure the security of our ally.
Russia is officially opening a new front in the war and announcing a hybrid mobilization. Today, so-called mobilization exercises suddenly began in Belarus near the borders with Ukraine, and the State Duma is preparing legislation so that Belarusians can serve in the Russian army. They say if you wanted a union state, then supposedly privileges also come with obligations, and now Belarusians will be forced to serve in the Russian army. Lukashenko himself warned the people that in the near future he would leave the country for a long time, supposedly on an official trip to see Putin and others. And it all looks like an escape, because tomorrow the 13th Forum of Regions of Belarus and Russia will take place in Minsk, which Lukashenko has never missed. The Wall Street Journal writes that Vladimir Putin has started demanding that Alexander Lukashenko help him escalate the conflict and has called in a favor for saving him from the protests in 2020. Sources in the European Union stated that Emmanuel Macron and Volodymyr Zelensky issued warnings to Lukashenko, including publicly. And Macron called and spoke on the phone with Lukashenko for an hour and a half in May, warning him that it would be better not to get involved in the war. But despite this, Moscow's pressure only increased. Meanwhile, Poland issued an urgent warning about the fact that Moscow is preparing a staged false flag provocation to justify further escalation using Belarus. But Putin himself is also preparing for a big war, and he is preparing Russians for it. The Kremlin is preparing new training grounds to train tens of thousands of recruits as early as October, that is, after the State Duma elections are held. Of course, Putin will not call this a mobilization, but the very fact of building new training grounds for accelerated soldier training already says a lot. Meanwhile, near Orenburg, after another attack, a key gas processing plant is on fire. This plant processed 60% of the gas in the Russian Federation. My name is Pechiy. Let's discuss all these topics together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and write any comment you want. So let's start by discussing mobilization within Russia itself. The Russian authorities are discussing the possibility of a new mobilization to reinforce the army fighting in Ukraine after the State Duma elections scheduled for September. This was reported by Verska and Important Stories, citing sources in military enlistment offices and contacts close to the Kremlin and the FSB. They reported that preparations for a mass army draft have been underway for several months. However, officially, nothing has been announced yet. It will never be officially called a mobilization. Starting in October, the Russian military will be ready to accept tens of thousands of people for accelerated training at additional training grounds that are currently being built. The thing is, the influx of contract soldiers who are being lured to the front with million-ruble bonuses from the Ministry of Defense is decreasing. In the first quarter, it dropped to 800 people per day, and according to Western intelligence estimates, it has stopped covering losses at the front line. The recruitment rate in Moscow has almost halved. 1,708 people in April, 1,378 in May, which is about 1,000 less than the year before. And next I'll give you a quote from the publication Verstka. "It's like there are no people left," one of the previously mobilized told Verstka. According to him, his regiment is at best 40% staffed, and the new recruits can't fight. Some are taken from prison, some from the streets. Homeless people in the literal sense of the word. Criminals, and already so old and sick that they can barely stand on their feet, he complains. And adding fuel to the fire is the fact that Russian generals allegedly guarantee Vladimir Putin full control over 4 Ukrainian regions if they have enough manpower. And Putin is ready to give them that manpower and try to fight for another 2 or 3 years. But still, Putin will try to postpone this mobilization until the very last moment and try, for example, to involve Belarusians in the war. And it is becoming more and more likely that Russia is planning to open a new front, specifically in Belarus. Today, So-called mobilization exercises have begun in Belarus, in the Grodno region. Military personnel are checking the data of conscripts. And according to the Belarusian Defense Department, the Ashmiany District Military Enlistment Office summoned reservists to clarify their personal information. The verification is taking place at the preliminary assembly point. It was previously reported that during the training, the issue of reinforcing military commissariats would be addressed by calling up reservists for military training, followed by their participation in the exercises. And now the called-up reservists will improve their military knowledge, master weapons and military equipment, and learn to carry out tasks assigned by their commanders. And against this background, there are more and more signs that Belarus is indeed getting closer to becoming a second front. The Wall Street Journal writes today that the Russian army is completely bogged down in Ukraine, and Vladimir Putin has started demanding that Alexander Lukashenko help him escalate the conflict. Moscow has started putting pressure, hoping to use Belarus again to expand the war, military campaigns against Ukraine or to carry out operations against NATO countries. And this became known in Europe and in Kyiv, and Emmanuel Macron and Volodymyr Zelensky issued warnings to Lukashenko, including publicly. According to intelligence, recently Russia has started demanding, in particular, to be allowed to use Belarusian territory to launch drone strikes against Ukraine and to open a new front closer to its western regions, in order to distract the armed forces of Ukraine from defending the eastern territories. In addition, Belarus may be involved in operations against neighboring NATO member countries, although these do not necessarily imply direct open combat. These could be attacks aimed at testing NATO's defense capabilities or undermining support for Ukraine. Well, for example, like the launch of about 20 drones into Poland from Belarusian territory last year, and now Vladimir Putin is threatening Alexander Lukashenko with ending financial support, which the Belarusian economy has always heavily depended on. And according to sources, negotiations on this issue are mainly being conducted between Lukashenko and the Russian ambassador to Belarus, Boris Gryzlov, but not exclusively. Well, for example, a week ago, Lavrov made an urgent trip to Minsk. We will discuss this a bit later. And it is known that the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, called Lukashenko in May and spoke with him for about an hour and a half. Paris has information that Belarus intends to step up its participation in the war. Macron reported this and warned Lukashenko against it. Macron's aide has already officially confirmed the fact of such a call, noting that the French president, quote, emphasized the risks that Belarus would face if it allowed itself to be drawn into Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Zelensky also stated in May that Kyiv received detailed information about negotiations between Russian and Belarusian officials on this matter. According to him, this indicates that Moscow is considering the possibility of using Belarus for potential military operations against Ukraine or the Baltic countries. Last week, Zelensky said he was giving Lukashenko a week to dismantle Russian relay stations on Belarusian territory. Zelensky stated that otherwise, according to the Ukrainian president, quote, he emphasized not to get involved. Otherwise, according to the Ukrainian president, Kyiv will eliminate the occupiers. Editor.
Zelensky's rude statement, demanding order be restored on the territory of a sovereign state. Otherwise, he says, he will take care of restoring order there himself.
I'll pause here for a moment to ask you to support this YouTube channel with your like, subscription, and a comment under this video. And also subscribe to my Patreon, where we have a closed community called Pechiy Insight, where you'll get exclusive analysis of topics that aren't covered here on YouTube. And there I also answer your personal questions, and we even hold separate Q&A streams there. But if you just want to support this YouTube channel one time, there are also different options and formats for how you can do that in the description of this video. I would be grateful for any support from you. Check the description, subscribe, and support the work of this channel. Now let's get back to how Russia is dragging Belarus into the war. Moreover, Russia is developing a legal framework to recruit Belarusian citizens into its armed forces. Russia might try to do this. To recruit Belarusians into its army because of the legal structure of the Union state. According to the treaty establishing it, Russians and Belarusians have a single citizenship status and theoretically equal rights. Therefore, the Kremlin may go even further and claim that equal rights also mean equal obligations. That is, service in the Russian armed forces will become mandatory. And for Belarusians, they say, well, this is a single union state, so it must be defended together as well. And now analysts from the Institute for the Study of War are warning that Russian officials may insist that Belarusians serve either in the Russian army or in Moscow-controlled formations of the Union State. Well, they say if you want, you can create a separate army, a kind of joint Belarusian army, and Russia. Let's call this a Union State formation, and let Belarusians serve there and, if necessary, fight for Russia. At the same time, the legal basis will be the unified legislation of the Union State, without any separate agreements with Minsk. In fact, this means that Belarus could turn into a de facto annexed territory from which Russia will draw human resources for the war. In addition to this, Alexander Lukashenko announced his long trip abroad and a meeting with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin. He stated this rather nervously at a meeting with the Prime Minister of Belarus, Alexander Turchin, and the entire meeting between Lukashenko and Turchin resembled a procedure for transferring authority, and it became obvious that Lukashenko would really be away from Belarus for a long time. The Belarusian dictator instructed the Prime Minister to prepare for the upcoming 13th Forum. The Forum of the Regions of Russia and Belarus, which is taking place in Minsk, actually starts tomorrow, by the way, and since he himself is going on a long business trip abroad. This is when the puzzle began to come together. Yesterday, on June 23, the head of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, stated that Russia will defend Belarus as part of the Union State. The day before in the Kremlin, Peskov said Belarus can defend itself up to its own borders. And a week earlier, Sergei Lavrov personally flew to Minsk, held talks there with Alexander Lukashenko, after which the Belarusian dictator announced that he was forced to urgently leave Belarus for an extended period. The official reason is a meeting with Putin, but Lukashenko himself emphasized that he is in contact with his Russian counterpart almost on a daily basis. Therefore, it would seem that there is no urgency to fly to meet with Putin. But still, Lukashenko says that he will leave Belarus for quite a long period. And now, Poland has stated that Moscow is preparing a staged false flag provocation to justify further escalation. The latest threats from the Russian leadership prompted an immediate response in Warsaw, comparing the Kremlin's actions to the preparations of the Third Reich for the attack on Poland in 1939. Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski stated that the latest accusations from the Kremlin are the informational groundwork for an operation by Russian intelligence services on their own Russian territory, to create a pretext for new strikes. Here's a quote from Sikorski. This sounds like the announcement of a provocation. I expect an attack on Russian territory under a false flag, to which Putin will be forced to respond. Let me remind you that in August 1939, the Abwehr staged an alleged Polish attack on the radio station in Gliwice to give themselves a pretext for war. What is this about? The reason for concern among European diplomats was Vladimir Putin's speech to the graduates of military academies just the other day in the Kremlin. And there, Putin stated that Russia would carry out retaliatory strikes against European countries if drone launches toward Russian targets are detected from their territory. The head of the Kremlin claimed that EU leaders are allegedly trying to distance themselves from the strikes, blaming everything on technical malfunctions or Ukrainian electronic warfare. He called the drone raids in Russia an attempt to destabilize society.
We see that if earlier NATO countries limited themselves to supporting the Kyiv regime, which came to power illegally through an armed coup, now it is open in the West. They say that they are preparing for war with us, increasing their military offensive budgets. At the same time, to justify such spending and the radical militarization of their countries, the leaders of NATO countries and the European Union, as before, use false statements about an alleged Russian military threat. The so-called democratic West follows a very simple pattern. First, they create threats to our country, force us to take the steps needed to defend ourselves, and then immediately accuse us of every sin in the book. To justify the continuation of their aggressive policy, their aggressive actions against Russia. Even we know all this very well, it's very familiar to us. Even after the treacherous attack on the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, truly a treacherous attack, the West, Hitler's Germany, tried to accuse the USSR and Stalin of aggression against what we now call the collective West. It's amazing, but this is still being discussed in quasi-scientific circles. I want to emphasize that Russia consistently stands for equal and indivisible security for everyone. We are convinced that this can only be achieved by forming a multipolar system of international relations and reliably ensuring the military security of every state. At the same time, we are ready to respond promptly and adequately to any external and internal threats.
And this statement by Putin was preceded by the May accusations from the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, which accused the Ukrainian armed forces of preparing drone launches directly from 5 military bases in Latvia, adding that NATO membership will not protect Riga. And finally, yesterday Putin stated that it is Europe that is preparing for a big war, and supposedly Europe is creating some kind of threats to Russia itself on Russian territory, to which Russia will be forced to respond. A big analytical episode on what Europe is preparing for and how was literally released this morning on this YouTube channel, so be sure to check it out. It's quite extensive, and it will make it clear what's really going on. And finally, I'll add one more piece of news that I just can't ignore. On the night of June 24, Ukrainian drones struck the Orenburg gas processing plant and the only helium plant in Russia. The mission of the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces was carried out in cooperation with the underground resistance movement Black Spark on the territory of the Russian Federation. The plants are located more than 1,200 kilometers from the front line. The Orenburg gas processing plant and the Orenburg helium plant form one large complex. The gas processing plant extracts purified natural gas and sulfur, which is also used for the production of explosives and black powder. But the Orenburg helium plant extracts purified sulfur-free gas and, using deep cooling methods, extracts the most valuable components from it, and there are only 2 of them. This is helium, an inert gas that is used in liquid-fueled rocket engines and guidance systems, and ethane, which is a key feedstock for synthesizing special plastics, which are also used in the production of weapons. So, the Orenburg gas processing plant is one of the largest gas chemical complexes in the world, commissioned in 1974. And back then, unfortunately, the West helped the wild Russians create such a giant. It's documented that it was the West, in fact, that built this plant by providing all the technologies to the Russians. The capacity of this facility is 45 billion cubic meters of gas per year. This plant accounts for 60% of all the gas processed by Gazprom in Russia. Overall, it's quite a significant target. And today, it was also hit, and very importantly, with the participation of those very partisans who are present in Russia and are waging their own war against Vladimir Putin's regime. Well, Putin has no choice but to escalate. And the only way he can escalate this war is by expanding it through the creation of a new front. And it's becoming quite obvious that once again Putin is trying to drag Belarus into this war, and to use not only the territory of Belarus, but, as has already become clear, also the Belarusians themselves, the citizens of Belarus, who will now be forced to fight for Russia because they agreed to the creation of the Union State. I'll leave it at that for now. Your opinion, your conclusions, write them in the comments under this episode. Please check the description of this video. There are links on how you can support the work of this YouTube channel with a one-time donation, and I encourage you to subscribe to my Patreon. This is a closed community called Pechiy Insight, where we discuss topics that aren't covered here on YouTube. There, I answer your personal questions. And there we will also hold private streams in a question and answer format. Go ahead, subscribe, and support this YouTube channel. Like this episode, and be sure to leave any comment under this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourself. Goodbye, everyone.